Hello, my name is Kiriath, and today we are going to have a little bit more of a chat about the potential of the return of the Silent King for the Necrons and what he might bring in terms of new models with him. Now, of course, this is assuming that we are going to get something major and interesting from the trailer that we saw on Sunday. I will put a link to the video for that in the description down below, and I will also point out I perhaps was a little too excited and not quite articulate enough in that video where we talked about the trailer. I just got carried away. Technically, the Silent King has been around for ages. He's been back for quite a while, but he's not really been at the forefront of anything. It's not like he's been like the central threat or anything like that. It's been very much a background role, I think it's fair to say, for quite a while at this point. Of course, the trailer that we saw from Games Workshop on the Warhammer community site kind of suggests that there is going to be something more interesting and more centre stage for the Silent King. They're assuming that they're not just messing with us massively. I would hope that they're not, because saying a regal return and doing a trailer like that very much gives some sort of indication as to something important going on. If you were to then turn around and go, it's nothing really, that's a very good way to get people thoroughly pissed off. So I hope that's not the case. This is one of those situations whereby I'm making assumptions. Like, massively making assumptions. I'm making the assumption that what it means is that we are going to get the Silent King as a model. My personal thought is that it'll probably be some sort of diorama, although he could just be a big, chunky lad like Zeraz, but I think probably it'll be probably not the same again, just because if you've got one big, chunky Necron lad, do you really want to do another one relatively soon in terms of releases, assuming we do see him anytime soon? Of course, all of that is very dependent on the current global situation and all the lockdown stuff and the fact Games Workshop aren't producing things. It's a whole thing. But I was going through the Necron range not that long ago. In fact, we did a range review for them a couple of weeks ago, last week maybe, and going through, I mean, for a start, I enjoyed doing that. It was a lot of fun doing that video because there were a few striking differences between things that I had playing Necrons when they first came out with their full codex in third, and what is available now. The biggest changes to me were things like the Tomb Spider and the Wraiths. Both very different now. Very, I would say, more streamlined and more interesting, but very different. And as we were going through, there was something that stuck out to me as being very different from the Necron stuff of old and the Necron stuff of not quite as old. And that is your green plastic rods. Your green plastic rods, your posing is a bit better now as well. Say a bit better, a lot better. And going through that range and kind of thinking about it a bit more, if we did see, this is all hypothetical, obviously, if we did see the Silent King be shifted to the forefront of the story for Warhammer 40k, if the next starter set, whether it be attached to a new edition or not, with the new starter set, the thing that replaces the current one, instead of it being Primaris versus Death Guard, were Primaris versus Necrons, that would be a very good opportunity to do some sort of more thorough range refresh for the Necrons themselves. If the Necrons have a resurgence of power, and if they are unified to some extent, obviously there would be the option to have dynasties that did not reunify, because they're not going to want to take away all of your personal stories for all of your Necron stuff. If it was suddenly a case of, if you play Necrons, you follow the Silent King, that would be a bit rubbish for those who have actually made a detailed narrative for their own forces. But if we assume that a lot of the fluff writing revolves around the mostly unification of the Necrons, it would kind of make sense for them to get some sort of extra attention. It would make sense for them to get essentially the treatment that Space Marines and Death Guard got with the release of Primaris and the new Death Guard stuff. I mean, that is what we saw for Dark Imperium, and I kind of feel like there are multiple things in the Necron range that could do with an update, some of which would actually work fairly well in a box. Now, of course, as I say, this is just like, this is extrapolating on an assumption that we don't even know is true. This is literally just wish listing. Don't take any of this as gospel. Don't even take it with a pinch of salt. It's just essentially, this would make sense to see. I would like to see it, but there's nothing to indicate that we will. So, I would assume that should we see a new starter set that was Primaris versus Necrons, and we've had plenty of different things saying that that is going to be the case at some point, attached to 9th, although I'm now starting to wonder whether that is just a misnaming, whether it's not actually like a 9th edition at all, whether it's just like an evolution of 8th. I mean, they did say 8th was going to be like, it was like a living edition kind of thing. Whether it be more of a AOS style update as opposed to here is an entire new edition. If we did see a new starter set, there are several models in the Necron range that could do with an update. Of course, there are a lot of models and a lot of ranges that could do with an update, but if we look at it in the context of a similar situation to Dark Imperium, but with the narrative shifted towards Imperium versus Necrons, as opposed to Imperium versus Chaos, there are 3 kits. Technically 5, but 2 of them are based on 1 of them, so don't worry about it. There are 3 kits that could really do with some sort of attention. There is the Warriors kit, because they still have the green plastic rods, and this is a theme, by the way. They still have the green plastic rods. The poses aren't quite as good as, say, the Immortals or the Lich Guard or the Praetorians or anything like that. They're looking a bit dated. Not terrible, but they look alright. They could do with a little bit of a refresh. You've got the flayed ones. Now, the flayed ones absolutely need updating. They are expensive, they are resin, they are also not as good as the flayed ones that I remember. In that video, in fact, in the range review for the Necron stuff, I couldn't remember. I was sure they weren't the flayed ones I had, and having done a bit of Googling after that video, they're not, and the ones I had looked way better. I'm going to try and put some pictures in here as we go along. Hopefully they'll render out. I've been having all sorts of issues with trying to get stuff to actually stay in videos when I edit them, but that's a rant for another occasion. Then there's also the Destroyers. Now, along with the Destroyers, you've got the Heavy Destroyer upgrade kit and the Destroyer Lord as well. If there was some sort of Dark Imperium situation whereby the Necrons got some sort of update, those 3 kits specifically, I'm not talking about heroes or like named characters, more accurately, just talking about standard kits. Warriors, Flayed Ones, and Destroyers are all pretty ripe for an upgrade. I would suggest the Monolith is as well, to be fair. The Monolith is definitely looking a little bit ancient, and not in the ancient technology way, just in the ancient model way, especially compared to the Obelisk. The Warriors and the Destroyers have the same innovation that that a lot of the Necron stuff had when it was first done with the actual codex, which is your little green plastic rods, which I still don't know if I even like those. From what I can tell, most people don't. So those are things that we just don't see. I mean, if you look at the new versions of Immortals, if you look at Lich Guard, if you look at Death Marks, like, all of that stuff is gone. They don't use that anymore. They haven't used it for quite some time. They've effectively phased it out of every new release Necrons has seen. So those models being the only ones left with them definitely point to them being the oldest, obviously. But it also means that there is a slight disconnect between your Warriors and your Destroyers to literally everything else in the range, because nothing else deals with that stuff anymore. And the only other things that do deal with it are the Monolith, which is the same age as those kits, and the Heavy Destroyer and Destroyer Lord, which are both iterations of the Destroyer. Now, if we saw that box, that theoretical box that we keep hearing about, and if it was the new starter set, which it's been suggested to be, it would make a lot of sense for Necrons to go into that box with a refreshed range of Warriors, a refreshed range of Destroyers, and new Flayed Ones. I mean, for a box itself, that would have a kind of reasonable, not symmetry, but it would have a nice kind of, that would be quite a nice force, basically. If you had a bunch of Warriors, if you had Flayed Ones for a bit of close combat action, and if you had Destroyers for a bit of anti-tank, that would be quite a decent little army by itself. And of course, all of those are old kits. They would hopefully need to be replaced to show up in a box. Not necessarily the case, but it would be nice. And it would leave a decent, like a decent chance for a kind of mirror Primaris force, something that is pretty much the same but different. Obviously, I mean, Dark Imperium had an interesting kind of difference in forces to it, but I don't know. It feels like that would make a lot of sense. It feels like that would be something that would work quite well as a kick-off to a new starter set, especially because you're not just throwing in stuff that people already have. You're throwing in something new. You are providing a decent kind of first buy experience for people who aren't yet involved in the game, but you're also providing a pretty heavy incentive for people who are already collecting to grab that box. If they introduce some sort of Primaris thing whereby we actually had unique sculpts of Primaris in there as well, that would also cover that side of things. The Silent King coming back into the forefront, like into the spotlight, feels like it should result in some hefty changes for Necrons. It should do something pretty significant to the overall narrative of 40k. I mean, we're not even so far like getting into or touching on the idea of Pariahs coming back either. In the trailer itself, we saw some interesting, very swole-looking Necrons. Don't think it's a literal thing. I don't think we're going to see like massively buff Necron dudes showing up. That seems kind of unlikely. But we could see something in the way of a brand new unit being part of said box. It's all obviously just wishlisting. It's all just kind of vague hopes based on something that actually we still don't really know 100% what it means. We don't have to wait that long to find out. I mean, what, the 23rd of May, so 11 days, so not next weekend, but the weekend after. It's not a devastatingly long time to wait. Quite like to know now, but it's not a devastatingly long time to wait. But if this is what it's all leading up to, if that is kind of what we're heading towards, that kind of refresh of the range just feels like it would make quite a lot of sense. It feels like something that would work very well for the introduction of a new starter set, of a shift in the narrative from the classic, don't get me wrong, the thoroughly classic Imperium versus Chaos, but it would actually allow them to spice things up a bit without necessarily having to massively change the setting. That's one of the things I think that is most interesting to me about this. When it comes to Chaos versus the Imperium, there's a lot that you can do, and there's also a lot that you can't do. A lot that you can't do because you need the universe to be in this constant state of never-ending war. You need that kind of constant back and forth with no true victor. Otherwise, one side would eradicate the other. And it seems unreasonable for the Imperium to eradicate Chaos, and it seems kind of a bold move for Chaos to finally prevail and have the Imperium be no longer really a focal point, because what would be left? Instead, if you can shift it away, if you have a force like the Necrons do not care for Chaos. They definitely don't want anything to do with Tyranids. Actually, that's not true. They want a lot to do with Tyranids. What they mostly want to do with Tyranids is to get rid of them. Those are both massive threats to the Imperium as a whole. Now, I could easily see it being a case of essentially just more war, rather than focusing on that kind of constant back and forth between Imperium and Chaos. You instead have this other, no less important battle going on between the Imperium and Necrons. The Imperium cannot fully commit to fighting the Necrons because they have to deal with every other threat that is surrounding and battering them every single hour of every single day. The Necrons also cannot fully commit to taking out the Imperium because the Imperium is helping them with Tyranids and Chaos. They also can't completely turn away from the Tyranids, because if they do so, the Tyranids could become strong enough that they aren't able to stop them, and if they consume all biomatter in the galaxy, then that means the Necrons will no longer have any delightfully fleshy bodies to go back into, which is what the Silent King is mostly after. And of course, they can't fully commit to pulling away from chaos either, because chaos will just engulf everything and wreck everything, and they don't like chaos, as evidenced by all their Blackstone shenanigans. It would be a nice aside, it would be a nice kind of still involved narrative that deals with the underlying issues of the Imperium versus everything else. Would also deal very well with the fact that the Imperium is massively xenophobic, because on paper, the Imperium and the Necrons don't have a huge reason to fight all that much. I mean, the Necrons acknowledge the Imperium's importance in holding back the Tyranids. They also will quite happily use them for that. If you go and read the Word of the Silent King, that gives a really fun indication as to just how little they really give a shit when it comes to like the lives of Imperial citizenry. Yes, we'll do a temporary alliance to fight this off. Oh, but if you take the brunt of the losses, that's okay with us. That kind of attitude works well in short doses, but if you do it too often, I'd imagine it could lead to a lot of disagreements and perhaps a just all-out war, even more so than they currently have. A lot of it makes a lot of sense, and I'm just kind of hoping that they do something with it, that they do something interesting, that they do actually embrace what it could potentially be and make something out of it, you know? But anyway, that was very rambly and borderline incoherent. I've just been thinking about it a lot over the last couple of days. Let me know what you think of all that in the comments down below. Feel free to click all the things, Patreon, video, subscribe, all that stuff. Click it if you like, don't click it if you don't want to. And of course, there's an affiliate link in the description for Element Games, which you can use to support the channel if you would like. I leave it entirely up to you. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.